Welcome to the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast. This podcast is dedicated to EAS employees of the U.S. Postal Service and members of the National Association of Postal Supervisors. So, pour yourself a cup of coffee and join us for today's episode. And now, here's your host, Robert Wakefield.
Good morning, Branch 32 of the National Association of Postal Supervisors, and good morning to our EAS friends wherever you may be listening. Welcome to the Saturday CuppaJoe presented by the Nashville Post Office Credit Union. My name is Robert Wakefield. I'll be your host for this podcast, and I hope that you will make it a weekly thing to listen in to the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast. Well, if you know anything about the Saturday CuppaJoe blog, well, you'll know what we're going to be doing for this podcast. So before we get started, let's pour that first cup. And our first cup is brought to you by the Nashville Post Office Credit Union. You know, the Nashville Post Office Credit Union was founded by 8 postal employees almost 100 years ago in 1925. NPOCU has a specialized niche in that we only serve the postal employees and their families. And once you or any member of your family joins the credit union, you are a member for life, no matter where you work, no matter where you worship, no matter where you live. Visit the Nashville Post Office Credit Union at npocu.org. In today's first cup, I wanted to call this the pilot program. This is the pilot. This is the show that kicks the whole thing off. This may last 2 months. It may last 2 weeks. I don't know. But if you're interested in listening to it, I'll try to put that information out there. So let me give you a little bit of background of why the podcast came about. It's called Saturday CuppaJoe because it's based on a blog that I wrote for over 2 years, which was called, amazingly, the Saturday CuppaJoe. And so what it was is I based it on 2 cups of coffee because here's what happened. On Saturdays, when I didn't work, back when I was working, my wife and I would sit on the back porch on a Saturday, and we would pour a cup of coffee and just chat. Just sit back and talk about the things that went on throughout the week, what we got coming up this week, those kinds of things, because I was always at work real early in the morning, like 5 in the morning, and she wasn't up yet. And so we never got to drink a cup of coffee until Saturday mornings. So the Saturday CuppaJoe blog was born, and it had tens of readers. Well, okay, it had a very nice readership, but the readership started trickling off, and when I saw it was trickling off, I thought, well, maybe there's something else we can do that would be better. So that's why this came about. This is how the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast came about. I'm so thankful that Branch 32 is going to allow me to do this. They are supportive of this. They are firmly behind this, and I thank all the members of Branch 32 for being behind this podcast. Branch 32 is the largest branch in the state of Tennessee. It's the largest branch in the Cotton Belt area with over 200 members. So we're very proud of that, and I'm very proud to be your president. So what does the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast look like? Well, I'm hoping, and this is no guarantee, I'm hoping that it will last about 15 minutes. 15 minutes is about a good amount of time to have a podcast, to discuss things, to discuss different kinds of issues. And maybe 15 minutes is too long. Maybe it's not long enough. I don't know. But that's going to be our goal. We're going to try to get it in and around that 15-minute area. It will also be 2 cups. Like we just mentioned, this was the first cup. This is the first cup. And on our first cup, we're going to talk about USPS issues, and we're going to talk about topics that you find necessary to talk about. We're going to talk about NAPS topics. If you're not a member of NAPS, why not? If you're not a member of NAPS, I'm so sorry. You are just amongst the bravest people I know. So you need to get into a NAPS branch very, very soon. We'll be talking about that too. So the first cup will always deal with USPS issues, NAPS issues, what have you. The second cup, I thought we'd be a little bit lighter. Talk about just some nonsensical things, or just simply like you would be sitting with your wife on the back porch talking with a cup of coffee, just sitting back and chatting. So it'll be lighter. There'll be some postal humor. There'll be some stories. But either way, that will be the format that we'll be using for the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast. One thing that I'm going to ask you to do is make this podcast interactive. That's right, interactive. Well, I want you to be a part of this podcast by participating. Now participation is very easy. We have an email address, and it's really difficult to remember. Let's see if you can do this. It's SaturdayCuppaJoe@gmail.com. SaturdayCuppaJoe@gmail.com. Now, CuppaJoe is CuppaJoe. So it's CuppaJoe. So be sure you remember that when you're sending an email. And I'd like to know where you're from. Like to know where you're listening to, what office you're in. I will not give out your name unless you want me to. Most of the time, we don't want our names out there, so if somebody's listening, we don't want to get in any kind of trouble. So if you just want to send me where you're listening from, that would be awesome. I'll recognize that in our first cup as well. So that's about what I want to do with the first cup. So after saying all that, let's go ahead and pour that second cup. Do you have outdated, confidential documents lying around your house that you are not sure what to do with? Well, bring your personal items to Shred Day at the Nashville Post Office Credit Union on Thursday, October 17th from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Shred Day provides you a great opportunity to reduce theft and security risk, free up some space, and get rid of some old, useless files. And to top it off, we'll even feed you some lunch. That's October 17th from 11 to 1 on Shred Day at the Nashville Post Office Credit Union. So for our second cup, I thought I would list some goals that I would love to see happen for the Saturday CuppaJoe podcast. I would love to see all of Branch 32 listen. They are my home branch based out of Nashville, Tennessee. It's Middle Tennessee Branch 32. Would love to have many of you listen in and talk about the podcast to all your friends. And then I would love to see it go all over the state of Tennessee. We have 6 branches in the state of Tennessee. It would be really cool to hear from them as well. We also have the Tennessee State Branch 947, where members all across the state could also get access to this podcast. And then I would think it would be really great if it expanded nationwide. It would be so cool to have supervisors listening from Walla Walla, Washington to Boston, Massachusetts. I mean, from one end of the country to the other. That would really be a cool thing to happen for this podcast. So I would love to see that. I want to do interviews. I would like to interview some of you and interview our national officers. I think that'd be cool. There's a way that we can do some live streaming where we can have some interaction where you call in and we talk about things. So we could do some of those in the future. I plan to bring the podcast equipment to national conventions and a state convention that I go to interview people and talk to folks. So I think that would be a heck of a lot of fun. And so this podcast is for you. It is for you. It's about you. It's about EAS. And so that's what I'm hoping that this podcast will be. So remember, the email address is SaturdayCuppaJoe@gmail.com. You can send us your questions. You can send us your complaints. Okay, don't send us your complaints, but you can send your questions for discussions or whatever you want to talk about. Send those to that email address, and we can try to get. We're going to do this podcast at least for a week or two. Oh, thank you so much for listening to the Saturday Cup of Joe podcast. And remember, every great weekend starts with a great cup of Joe. I'm Robert Wakefield. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for tuning in to the Saturday Cup of Joe podcast. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of Robert Wakefield and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Association of Postal Supervisors. We welcome your questions and comments, so send those to SaturdayCupOfJoe@gmail.com.
Welcome to the Saturday Cup of Joe podcast. This podcast is dedicated to EAS employees of the U.S. Postal Service and members of the National Association of Postal Supervisors. So, pour yourself a cup of coffee and join us for today's episode. And now, here's your host, Robert Wakefield.